At my son's wedding, in front of 450 guests, his father-in-law mocked me. Good thing in the groom escaped that old pigist. Hi, welcome to my channel. This is my new story.
I raised my son on my own, yet at his wedding, his father-in-law humiliated me in front of more than 450 guests. I turned to look at my son. He avoided my eyes, lowering his head, as if he had nothing to do with it. In that moment, I understood he knew everything, and he chose to stay silent. They thought I was weak. They thought I had no power to fight back. But they made a mistake. As I slowly stood up, the very first words I spoke began to wipe the smiles off their faces completely. I truly appreciate you being here. Before we continue, take a moment to comment where you're watching from your city or country. I'd love to know who's here with me. This story includes fictional elements created for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental, but the message shared may still be meaningful to you. The Greenbrier knows how to make you feel small. That's not an insult, it's architecture. The ceilings in the main ballroom climb so high above your head that even your best posture can't reach them. The chandeliers drip crystal like frozen rain, throwing light across 450 place settings of bone china and silver that's been polished by hands that will never sit at these tables. It's the kind of room that was built to remind certain people exactly where they stand and to remind everyone else to stay quiet about it. I had been quiet for a long time. I sat at the far end of the room table, 12 against the wall nearest the service corridor. Not an accident. Nothing about seating arrangements at a Voss event ever happened by accident. My place card was written in the same elegant gold ink as everyone else's, but I noticed they'd spelled my name with 2 L's. Carolyn. One small letter off like a door left open just enough to let in the cold. I straightened the card, set it back down, and rested both hands flat on the white linen tablecloth, the way my mother taught me to sit when I needed to hold myself together from the inside out. January in White Sulphur Springs carries a particular kind of silence. Outside the tall windows, the Allegheny Mountains were buried under snow that had been falling for 2 days straight. The world beyond the glass looked like something erased, but in here the room hummed with the low voltage of old money, the clink of crystal, the shuffle of a string quartet, playing something European and forgettable, the specific laughter of people who learned long ago that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful one. I wore my pharmacist badge. I know how that sounds. A formal black-tie dinner at the Greenbrier, 450 guests in gowns and tuxedos, and I walked in with my badge still clipped to the lapel of my dress. It wasn't defiance, not exactly. It was the only thing I owned that night that told the truth about who I was. Carolyn Mercer, PharmD, licensed in the state of West Virginia, 22 years behind a counter in Huntington, mixing prescriptions for people who couldn't always afford them. That little rectangle of laminated plastic was the most honest thing in the room, and I wasn't ready to take it off, Harriet noticed. She leaned over from the seat beside me, Harriet, my oldest friend, the woman who had driven 4 hours from Columbus, because I'd asked her to, and because she knew without me saying it out loud, that I shouldn't be alone in this room. She looked at the badge, looked at me, and didn't say a word. That's the thing about a friendship that goes back 30 years. Sometimes the most important conversations happen entirely in silence. I watched Beckett from across the room. My son sat 3 tables away at the center of the arrangement closest to the head table. Of course he did. He was 31 years old, and he looked like the version of himself I had always hoped he'd grow into, broad-shouldered, clear-eyed, the kind of easy confidence that you either inherit or earn through a great deal of pain. I knew which one it had been for him. I had been there for all of it. The years in the apartment on Fifth Avenue when the heat quit every February. The scholarship applications we filled out together on the kitchen table while I worked double shifts. The graduation I watched from the second row of a folding chair with tears I didn't bother wiping because there was no one beside me to notice. He was laughing at something Sabrina said. Sabrina Voss, soon to be Sabrina Mercer, a detail the family hadn't fully processed yet sat beside him in a gown the color of winter sky, her dark hair pinned up in the way that required a professional and a full morning to accomplish. She was lovely. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy and maybe expected to say otherwise. She was genuinely lovely, and she looked at my son the way a woman looks at a man she has chosen deliberately and without reservation. I had no complaint about Sabrina. It was the man who raised her that I had come to understand. Harlan Voss stood at the head of the room like a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged there. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, built like someone who had played football a very long time ago, and still carried the memory of it in his posture. He had the handshake, the eye contact, the measured pause before speaking that powerful men practice until it becomes reflex. When he reached for his crystal glass and rose to his feet, the room responded the way rooms do for men like him. The conversation died in sections, table by table, like lights going out in a building. 450 faces turned toward the front. He began with the Voss family. He always began with the Voss family. 3 generations of pharmaceutical distribution, a legacy built on integrity and vision, a name that meant something in every room from Charleston to Washington. He talked about Sabrina the way a man talks about his finest accomplishment, not unkindly, but with the particular ownership of a father who has never fully understood the difference between raising a daughter and curating one. She was perfect, he said. She had always been perfect. The room smiled and nodded and swirled their wine. Then he turned to Beckett, and then with a smile that never moved from his face, he turned to me. He did it carefully. I'll give him that. Every word was technically a compliment, the kind that arrives wrapped in silk and lands like a stone. A resilient woman. The kind of mother who sacrifices everything. Huntington's own. He talked about my son's journey the way a man describes a rescue operation. How Beckett had found his way, had risen above his circumstances, had built something from nothing. He said it warmly. He said it with his hand over his heart. And with every gracious, well-constructed sentence, he made sure that every person in that room understood exactly what he meant. Your son had to escape you to become someone worth knowing. I looked at Beckett. Beckett did not look at me. He stared at the tablecloth, his jaw set in the particular way it had been set since he was 9 years old, and trying not to show that something hurt. I knew that jaw. I had watched it learn to do that. And I understood, in the way that mothers understand things they wish they didn't, that his stillness wasn't agreement, it was survival. He was doing what you do when the most powerful person in your future family is speaking, you wait. Under the table, Harriet found my hand. Her fingers closed around mine slowly, without urgency, the way you hold something you're afraid might break. I let her. I kept my eyes on Harlan, who was building to his conclusion, now wrapping his remarks in the language of celebration of new beginnings of 2 families becoming one. The string quartet had paused. The room was perfectly attentively still. He raised his glass. The applause that followed was the kind that fills a room without warming it. Correct, prompt, and cold, as the mountain air pressing against those tall windows outside. Crystal rang against crystal. 450 people smiled at the future. I pushed back my chair. The sound it made against the marble floor was small, a single quiet scrape. But in that half-second of settled silence after applause, it cut through the room like something sharp. Heads turned. I felt the shift in attention move toward me like a wave, unhurried and inevitable. Harlan's smile held, but his eyes found mine, and in them I saw the first honest thing of the evening's surprise. I stood up straight. The badge on my lapel caught the light from the chandeliers above, throwing a small bright point across the white tablecloth. I looked at Harlan Voss. I looked at the 450 faces now watching me. I looked for just a moment at my son who had finally raised his eyes, and I said in a voice I had not used in a very long time, "Do you all want to know who I actually am? There are questions a room full of people cannot answer for you." Standing there in that black dress, the silence pressing in from every direction. I wasn't thinking about Harlan Voss or the wine or the faces waiting to see what a woman from Huntington would do next. I was thinking about a Thursday night in March 32 years ago when I learned that the world could change completely between one breath and the next. Let me take you back there. Huntington, West Virginia, March 1993. The kind of winter that doesn't know it's almost over, the cold still sitting heavy on the Ohio River, the streets still gray with the grime of a city that has been working too hard for too long. I was 32 years old. My husband Robert was 34. 6 weeks earlier, in a delivery room at St. Mary's Medical Center, our son had come into the world screaming like he had something urgent to say. We named him Beckett. Robert picked it. He said it sounded like a name that could belong to anyone, a professor, a carpenter, a senator. Give him room to become whatever he wants, Robert said, and I loved him for thinking that way. Our house was small, the way starter homes are small when you buy them young and slightly naive about what square footage means when you're living in it every day. 800 square feet on Cyrus Creek Road, a porch that needed painting, a kitchen that caught the morning light in a way that made even instant coffee feel like something worth sitting down for. Robert worked nights at the chemical processing plant out on the eastern edge of the county, steady work, solid benefits, and in 1993 in Cabell County. That combination was not something you walked away from. On the nights he worked, he always kissed me before he left. I used to tease him about it. You kiss me like you're leaving for a long trip, I'd say. He'd grin that half grin of his and say, every shift is a long trip when you've got something this good to come home to. Corny. Completely corny. He knew it and said it anyway because Robert had decided somewhere along the way that sincerity was worth more than being cool about it. That Thursday, he kissed me at the door at 10:45. Beckett was asleep in the back room. The street was quiet. I watched his truck pull out of the driveway and went back inside to finish the dishes. The phone rang at 11:17. I know the exact time because I had just checked the clock above the stove. 11:17. The ring cut through the house in a way that felt different from ordinary rings. I know that sounds like something people say after the fact, memory rearranging itself to fit the story, but I remember putting down the dish towel before I even picked up the receiver. The same way you brace yourself before opening a door you already know leads somewhere you don't want to go. The voice belonged to the shift supervisor at the plant. Flat efficient, the tone of someone who has delivered this kind of news before and has learned that brevity is not cruelty, it's mercy. There had been an incident at the facility. Robert had been involved. He was being transported. I don't remember getting Beckett from his crib. I don't remember finding my keys or driving the 11 miles to the hospital. What I remember is arriving the emergency bay lit in alternating red and blue, the color washing across wet pavement in patterns that didn't make sense, the automatic doors opening and releasing warm antiseptic air that hit me like a wall. I was holding Beckett against my chest, 6 weeks old, wrapped in the blue fleece blanket his grandmother had sent from Parkersburg, his face turned toward my collarbone, impossibly small and impossibly trusting. They came to me in sequence. A nurse, then the plant's operations manager, a man in a collared shirt who had clearly rehearsed what he was about to say, then a hospital administrator. Each one delivered another layer of a story I was still trying to refuse. 2 other workers had been in the lower processing unit when something failed, something in the ventilation, something in the pressure regulation, something the overnight crew had flagged in earlier reports that had somehow never become action. Robert was one of 3 men who did not come home that night. I sat in a waiting room chair with my son against my chest and looked at the operations manager's face when he finished speaking. He had the expression of a man relieved to have a difficult conversation nearly over with. Almost in the same breath as his condolences, he mentioned that the company had already initiated an internal review, a full report within 90 days. Preliminary findings pointed to operational error. Operational error. 2 words. Clean, contained, already steering away from anything that might require a harder look. I said nothing. I looked down at Beckett, the rise and fall of his chest, his tiny fingers finding the edge of my sleeve and closing around it in sleep. Outside the window, the red and blue lights still moved across the parking lot. The mountains were invisible in the dark. Something settled in me that night that has never fully come undone. Not grief. Grief came later in waves in the middle of grocery aisles and in the car line at Beckett's school years afterward. What settled in me in that waiting room was something quieter and more durable. A question. Small and persistent, like a crack in a foundation wall that nobody bothers to fix because the house is still standing. The report arrived exactly on schedule. 90 days. Official findings. Unavoidable industrial accident. Case closed with the finality of paperwork signed by people with lawyers reviewing every comma. Too clean. Too fast. Too neatly resolved for something that had taken 3 lives and left 3 families with a loss that had no real answer at the bottom of it. I didn't push back. Not then. I was 32 years old with a 6-week-old baby and a mortgage I could barely reach. I did what a woman in that position does. I survived. I got up every morning. I found a way. But that night in the hard plastic waiting room chair with my son sleeping against me and the world rearranged into a shape I didn't recognize, I made Robert a promise. Silently, the way you make promises to people who can no longer hear you out loud. I told him I would find out what really happened. I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know if I ever would. I folded that promise up and placed it somewhere deep inside me, beneath the grief and the exhaustion and the years that were already beginning to stack themselves between that night and whatever came next. I had made him that promise without knowing it would take 32 years to keep it. Grief, I learned, is not the enemy of action. Sometimes it is the engine of it. The decision to go back to school didn't come to me as inspiration. It came the way most important decisions come quietly in the middle of an ordinary moment. I was standing in the kitchen on Cyrus Creek Road 7 months after that night at the hospital, reading the label on a bottle of medication the doctor had prescribed for my nerves. I turned it over in my hands. Active compounds, contraindications, interaction warnings printed so small you needed good light and patience to read them. And somewhere in that small print, a question took shape that I couldn't put back down. What exactly was in the air that night at the plant? What kind of compound does that to a man in under an hour? If I understood the chemistry, maybe I could understand the world that had taken Robert from us. I enrolled in the pharmacy program at Marshall University in the fall of 1994. Beckett was 8 months old. I arranged my classes around his nap schedule and studied at the kitchen table after he went to sleep textbooks, spread between a cold cup of coffee and whatever toy he'd left within arm's reach. Financial aid covered tuition. Robert's life insurance modest, but they're covered the rest month by month the way you stretch a jar of peanut butter when you're not sure when you'll be able to buy another one. That was when Harriet walked into our lives. She had moved into the house 2 doors down in early 1994, a former high school art teacher from Columbus who had followed her husband's job transfer to Huntington and then found herself in the city, alone when the marriage quietly unraveled the following year. We met the way neighbors meet when they have no particular reason to avoid each other over a fence, over borrowed sugar. Over the particular solidarity of 2 women managing more than they'd planned to. Harriet was loud where I was reserved, spontaneous where I was careful and completely unafraid of the kind of honesty that most people politely step around. She became Beckett's second home before either of us had consciously decided that was what was happening. When Beckett was 2, he took his first real steps across Harriet's kitchen floor toward a wooden spoon she was holding out like a finish line ribbon. When he was 4, he climbed into my lap one evening and asked with the directness that only small children can carry without cruelty where his daddy had gone. I told him the truest version of the truth I could manage for a 4-year-old, that his father had been a good man who loved him before he even knew him, and that some people leave earlier than anyone plans for. Beckett thought about this for a long moment, then asked if we could have pancakes. Children have a grace about them that adults spend years trying to recover. In June of 1999, on a warm Saturday morning in the Marshall University Gymnasium, I walked across a stage and received my degree. Harriet had driven her husband at the time, a quiet, steady man named Garrett, who had more patience than most people are born with, and Beckett, who was 6 years old and dressed in a button-down shirt he'd already pulled halfway out of his pants, rode on Garrett's shoulders above the crowd to get a better view. He spotted me crossing the stage and yelled, "That's my mom," at a volume entirely disproportionate to the solemnity of the occasion. I heard it from 50 feet away. I kept my composure until I got back to my seat, and then I didn't. Huntington General Hospital hired me in the fall of 1999. The pharmacy department was on the second floor, tucked between radiology and the administrative wing, a room that smelled permanently of printer toner and disinfectant and the particular staleness of recycled hospital air. It was not glamorous. It was exact, demanding, and occasionally thankless in the way that all work becomes when the people receiving it are too frightened or too sick to say thank you. That was where I met Linda. Linda was the head nurse on the internal medicine floor, a broad-shouldered woman from Mingo County who had been in that hospital for 16 years by the time I arrived and knew every shortcut, every workaround, and every doctor's particular brand of stubbornness better than those doctors knew themselves. She laughed more than almost anyone I had ever met, the kind of full-body laugh that made everyone within earshot feel briefly better about things. But behind that laugh was a woman who had watched her community absorb more loss than it should have had to, and had decided somewhere along the way that noticing things carefully was the least she could do. We became friends over the supply room coffee maker, which was terrible, and over the kind of work that builds trust faster than almost anything else, the daily, unglamorous business of keeping people alive. The first time I noticed something wrong, it was 2005. A prescription came across my counter. Not unusual in itself, prescriptions came across my counter hundreds of times a day. But this one stopped me. The dosage was listed at 10 times the standard therapeutic amount for the medication in question, a powerful painkiller in the opioid family that had legitimate uses in post-surgical care, but had a careful ceiling that responsible practice did not cross lightly. I flagged it, called the prescribing physician, was told the dosage was intentional, that the patient had special circumstances, that I should process it. I processed it. I wrote a note in the file. Then another one came, and another. Over the following weeks, a pattern began to assemble itself on my counter, the way patterns do when you are trained to see them not loudly, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small details that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. Dosages that made no clinical sense. Prescriptions for patients whose addresses placed them 2 counties away from any physician listed on the form. Refill schedules that assumed a consumption rate no legitimate treatment protocol could justify. Linda had noticed the same rhythm on her floor. She came to me one afternoon, leaned against the pharmacy counter with her arms crossed, and said in the careful, quiet voice she reserved for serious things, "Tell me you're seeing what I'm seeing." I told her I was. Outside the hospital, Huntington was beginning to change in ways that were visible if you knew where to look. Faces in the waiting room that came back too often, too thin, too young. Families arriving at the emergency entrance with a specific kind of desperation that I had not seen in my first years there, but was becoming by 2005 something I recognized on sight. A city of working people who had built their lives around steel and coal and chemical work industries that had already been leaving for years, now absorbing something new and quiet and devastating that came in small orange bottles with printed labels. I started keeping my own records, a second log, personal unofficial, maintained in a spiral notebook I kept in my bag. Every prescription that crossed my counter and didn't sit right, dates, dosages, physician names, patient zip codes, and at the bottom right corner of every suspicious form printed in the small, clean font of a company that had learned to make itself easy to overlook, Crestline Pharma Group, Charleston, West Virginia. The same name, every time. Every prescription that should never have existed led back to the same name, and that name would follow me for the next 20 years. I memorized all 47 of them. Not their case numbers, not their chart IDs or their insurance codes, or the clinical shorthand that reduces a human being to a set of presenting symptoms on a printed form. Their names. I wrote them in the back of a second notebook separate from the prescription log. separate from everything professional and procedural, and I read them before I went to sleep the way some people read scripture. Because the moment you let a name become a statistic, you have already lost something you cannot get back. 47 people in the first month after I recognized the pattern. 47 individuals who had come through the doors of Huntington General in varying degrees of crisis after consuming quantities of medication that no legitimate prescription should have. Authorized. Some of them recovered fully. Some recovered partially. Some left the hospital in a condition that made the word recovery feel dishonest. I knew all their names. He came in on a Tuesday night in October, wheeled through the emergency entrance on a gurney with 2 paramedics, calling out his vitals to whoever was close enough to hear. 18 years old. 160 pounds. Unresponsive. The attending physician on duty that night was already managing 2 other critical cases, so the stabilization work fell to the team around him and to me because the medication protocol required pharmacy authorization at every step. His name was Darnell Washington. I worked through the counter protocol with the focus that emergency situations demand, the kind of concentration where the room narrows to exactly what needs to happen next, and everything else. The noise, the fluorescent light, the low-grade hum of the building's heating system falls completely away. When his condition stabilized and the immediate danger passed, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 40 minutes. Linda appeared at my elbow. She had been on the floor all evening, and I could tell from the set of her shoulders that she had been watching since Darnell came through the door. She looked at his face for a long moment, the particular stillness of someone placing a memory they weren't expecting to find here. Then she said quietly, "I was in the room when he was born, 18 years ago. His mother's name is Vera. She worked the morning shift at the Kroger on 5th Avenue for as long as I can remember. The thing about a city the size of Huntington is that it is always underneath everything a small town. Everyone is connected to everyone else by 1 or 2 degrees of a shared history that stretches back through schools and churches and factory floors and hospital corridors. Linda had helped bring this boy into the world. And now here we were, the 3 of us connected by something that had no name yet, but was already pulling tight. Darnell recovered. It took 3 days. On the morning he was well enough to sit up and hold a cup of water on his own, I stopped by his room before my shift began. We didn't talk about what had happened, not directly. I sat in the chair beside his bed and asked him about himself the way you ask someone when you genuinely want to know the answer. He told me he had been working at an auto shop on the west side, that he had started taking the pills for a back injury 6 months earlier, that he hadn't understood not really what the pills were doing to him until they were already doing it. Before I left, I gave him Linda's phone number. "She knows your mother," I said. "Call her if you need anything." He looked at me the way young people look at older women who are kind to them without explanation. Slightly suspicious, slightly grateful, not quite sure what to do with either feeling. In February of 2006, I submitted a formal report to the FDA. I had spent 3 months assembling it, the prescription logs, the dosage records, the geographic distribution of affected patients, the statistical deviation from standard therapeutic norms. 87 pages, documented, sourced, cross-referenced. I had asked a pharmacist colleague in Charleston to review my methodology before I sent it, and he had told me it was the most thorough complaint submission he had ever seen from a single practitioner. 8 weeks later, a letter arrived. It was brief, formally worded. It thanked me for my submission and informed me that upon preliminary review, the documentation provided was deemed insufficient to establish a clear pattern of systemic violation. The case had been closed. I was encouraged to resubmit if additional evidence became available. I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it down on the kitchen table and sat very still for a while. Someone had moved quickly. The kind of quickly that requires the kind of reach that doesn't come from a single pharmacy distributor operating out of Charleston. I didn't know yet exactly whose hand had been on that process, but I had spent enough years reading fine print to understand when a document has been written to close a door rather than examine what's behind it. I kept the letter. I filed it in the same cabinet as the prescription logs, And I kept building the record because that was the only thing I knew how to do. Linda was diagnosed in the spring of 2012. She didn't tell most people right away that was her way absorbing difficulty privately until she'd had enough time to make peace with it before inviting others into the conversation. By the time she told me, the cough had already been going on for longer than either of us wanted to calculate out loud. She had the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix, the kind that accumulates when a body has been giving more than it receives for too many years running. She worked through the fall. She worked through the winter. She came in for her shifts with the same full-body laugh and the same exact eye for every workaround in the building. And if you didn't know what you were looking at, you might not have seen anything different at all. She left us in April of 2013. A warm spring morning, the dogwoods already blooming along the hospital entrance road, the kind of day that feels deliberately cruel in its beauty when something heavy is happening inside it. Darnell stood at the graveside in a dark jacket that was slightly too big for him, his hands folded in front of him, his face completely still. He had known Linda through his mother through the years of recovery that had followed that October night, through the steady thread of connection she had maintained with his family, the way she maintained connection with everyone she had ever decided mattered. He stood there, and he did not cry the way some people cannot cry when the loss is large enough that the usual machinery simply stops working. I stood beside him. I placed my hand on his shoulder. And standing there in the April light with the dogwood petals falling and Linda's name on the stone in front of us, I made a promise. Not the silent, private kind I had folded away in a hospital waiting room 20 years earlier, but the kind you make to someone who can no longer hold you to it and therefore deserves it more. I told her I would finish it. That was the day I stopped filing reports and started building something that couldn't be dismissed with a form letter. There are moments in a life that arrive disguised as opportunities. The letter came first, formal letterhead, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, postmarked the second week of January 2009. I almost missed it in the stack of hospital circulars and utility bills that accumulated on the kitchen counter through the winter months. But the return address stopped me, and I stood at the counter in my coat grocery bags, still in hand, and read it through twice before I set anything down. Lead clinical pharmacist, a newly created position within their research and patient safety division, a salary of $195,000 a year, more than 3 times what Huntington General was paying me with research funding, a staff of 4, and access to a data infrastructure that would have taken me another decade to build on my own in West Virginia. I set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. From the living room, I could hear Beckett. He was 16 that January, deep in the particular self-contained universe that teenagers construct around themselves, headphones on textbooks open, pencil moving across a page in the rhythmic way that meant he was actually working and not just performing the appearance of it. His hair was doing what his hair always did when he hadn't had a haircut in a few weeks, curling at the back of his neck in a way that still made him look from certain angles, exactly like the 6-year-old who had yelled, "That's my mom," across a gymnasium. He had no idea I was standing in the kitchen holding a piece of paper that could change everything about both our lives. I watched him through the doorway. He reached up without looking and adjusted one side of his headphones, then went back to writing. 16 years old and already carrying himself with the focused quietness of someone who had learned early that the world required effort and had simply decided to give it. He was making good grades. He had 2 friends he'd kept since middle school. He had a part-time job at the hardware store on Saturdays that he'd found himself and hadn't asked me to help him get. He was rooted here in this city in this particular life we had built on Cyrus Creek Road. And I had 47 names in a notebook. I had a prescription log that now ran to 3 volumes. I had a name Crestline Pharma Group printed in the corner of more irregular orders than I could count, and a closed FDA file that told me someone with significant reach had decided my documentation wasn't worth examining. I had started building something that couldn't be dismissed with a form letter, and Pittsburgh was 4 hours away. I picked up the phone and called the number on the letterhead. I thanked the program director for the offer. I told him I had obligations in Huntington that I wasn't in a position to step away from. He was gracious about it, told me the offer would remain open for 30 days if I changed my mind. I didn't change my mind. That evening, after Beckett had gone to bed, I folded the letter, carefully carried it to the kitchen stove, and held it over the burner. I watched it go. It was not a dramatic gesture. I wasn't the dramatic type. It was simply the clearest way I knew to make a decision feel final. Some doors, once you've decided not to walk through them, are better closed completely. I went to bed. In the morning, I went back to work. The years between 2009 and 2022 were the years of building. Slow, unglamorous, methodical work, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't attract attention, which was precisely the point. I expanded the personal record. I connected with 2 other pharmacists in the region who had noticed similar irregularities in their own counties. I corresponded carefully and without using institutional channels with a retired DEA analyst in Roanoke who'd spent 20 years tracking distribution patterns and understood exactly what the numbers I was describing meant. The picture that assembled itself across those years was larger and more deliberate than anything I had initially allowed myself to believe. But I kept it quiet. I kept going to work. I watched Beckett finish high school, earn a full scholarship to West Virginia University, and leave for Morgantown on a Sunday morning in August of 2011 with 2 bags and the particular expression of a young man who is ready and terrified in equal measure and trying hard to show only the ready part. I drove home from dropping him off and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. He called on a Thursday evening in March of 2022. I was at the kitchen table. Different table now, same house, same kitchen, going through a set of distribution records I had obtained through a public filing request. The phone rang and it was Beckett, which was not unusual. What was unusual was his voice. There is a register that I had not heard from my son before, bright and slightly unsteady the way a person sounds when something has happened that they are still processing even as they describe it. He had been in Charleston for a business conference. Something in the financial services sector, he had built a career in corporate risk consulting, which struck me more than once as the universe having a particular sense of humor about genetics. At a reception on the second evening, he had met someone. Her name was Sabrina. He described her the way people describe a person when the description is already running ahead of the facts, the way she'd held her own in a conversation about regulatory frameworks with 3 men, who were clearly not accustomed to being held to account the way she'd laughed at something he said and then immediately said something sharper and funnier back. The conference he mentioned in passing had been underwritten in part by the Crestline Foundation, a philanthropic arm attached to a pharmaceutical distribution company based in Charleston. I stopped moving. I set down the pen I had been holding. I waited until Beckett finished his sentence, and then I said I needed to write something down and asked him to spell her last name. Voss, he said. Sabrina Voss. Her father runs the whole operation. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the March wind was moving through the bare branches of the oak tree in the backyard, the one Robert had planted the spring before Beckett was born, because he'd read somewhere that a yard needed at least 1 tree worth climbing. I could hear it from where I was sitting. I wrote the name down, closed the notebook, opened my laptop. Harlan Voss, Chief Executive Officer, Crestline Pharma Group, Charleston, West Virginia. Appointed 1998. Reappointed 2006. Recipient of the West Virginia Business Leadership Award in 2010, 2015, and 2019. Photographed at 6 different state government functions between 2005 and 2020. A man who had been standing in plain sight for 20 years, unreachable, untouched, and apparently quite comfortable with both. From the phone still open on the table, I heard Beckett's voice. "Mom, you still there?" I looked at the name on my screen. I looked at the notebook. I looked at the window and the bare oak branches moving in the dark. The man whose company had been flooding my city for 17 years had just met my son, and I was the only person in the world who knew it. Secrets have a weight that compounds over time. I had been carrying mine for 30 years by the time I decided I could no longer carry it alone. Not the grief you learn to distribute across the architecture of a life. Tuck it into the spaces between ordinary things until it becomes part of the structure rather than a burden on top of it. What I mean is the other thing. The question that had never closed. The crack in the foundation wall that I had spent 3 decades measuring without ever knowing what was on the other side of it. In the spring of 2023, I walked into the offices of the Huntington Herald and asked to speak with Marlo Cooper. I had read her work for years. Marlo was 41, though she had the particular quality of someone who has been doing serious work long enough that age becomes irrelevant to the impression she made. What you notice first was the focus, the way her attention landed on you and stayed there without shifting. Her desk was the kind of organized chaos that signals genuine productivity rather than disorder stacks of folders with hand-labeled tabs. A corkboard behind her monitor layered with documents and printed pages, and strings of colored thread connecting points she was still working out. She had covered the region's economic decline for a decade, the kind of long-form accountability journalism that requires patience. Most newsrooms no longer have the budget to support. And on the left side of her corkboard, slightly above eye level, fixed with a single pushpin, was a photograph. I recognized it immediately. A hospital corridor fluorescent light, a broad-shouldered woman in scrubs laughing at something off-camera with the full body ease of someone completely at home in her own skin. Marlo noticed me looking. "Linda Garrett," she said. Not a question. She was my first source on the distribution story back in 2010. Came to me on her own, walked in through that same door. You just came through, sat down in that chair, and handed me 3 months of her own personal records. She paused. I never got the story published. My editor killed it 2 days before we went to press. I kept the photo to remind myself it happened. I sat down in the chair. I put my bag on the floor. And I told Marlo Cooper everything I had been building for 17 years. She listened for 2 hours without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then pulled a gray filing box from the shelf behind her desk and set it between us on the table. She had her own records assembled independently through different channels from a different angle. Distribution contracts obtained through public filings. Lobbying expenditure reports from the state legislature. A series of campaign contribution records that traced a consistent pattern of financial support, flowing from Crestline-affiliated entities to 4 specific members of the West Virginia Regulatory Oversight Committee between 2004 and 2018. We had been building toward the same wall from opposite sides. We began meeting every Tuesday evening at her office after the rest of the staff had gone home. We worked methodically the way you work when you understand that the thing you are assembling has to be structurally sound before it can bear any weight. Marlo brought the investigative architecture source verification document, authentication, the legal frameworks that determined what could be published and what required additional corroboration. I brought 30 years of pharmaceutical records pattern analysis and the particular credibility of a licensed practitioner who had documented everything in real time. 3 months in, on a Tuesday evening in late August, Marlo set a folder on the table between us that she had not shown me before. "I need you to be steady when you look at this," she said. I told her I was steady. The document inside was a single page photocopied from a microfilm archive at the State Records Office in Charleston. The original had been filed under a subsidiary company name, a holding entity that had since been dissolved and had sat in the archive for 30 years without anyone connecting it to the events. At the processing plant in Cabell County in March of 1993. It was an investment record dated 1991. Listing Harlan Voss as a primary stakeholder in the chemical processing facility on the eastern edge of Cabell County, the same facility where Robert had worked the night shift. The same facility where 3 men had not come home on a Thursday night in March of 1993. His financial stake had been quietly liquidated 4 months after the incident through a series of transfers that were legal in their structure and deliberate in their timing. I looked at the page. I kept my hands flat on the table. Then Marlo reached into the folder again. The second document was older. The paper had gone the color of old tea at the edges, the kind of yellowing that happens when something has been stored in a place that was never meant for long-term preservation. It had been discovered inside a sealed internal file from the plant's HR department, misfiled under a routine maintenance log, which was likely the only reason it had survived at all. It was a formal internal complaint, handwritten, 2 pages. The handwriting was Robert's. I knew it the way you know a voice you have not heard in 30 years instantly, without needing to reason through it, the body recognizing what the mind hasn't finished processing yet. The particular way he formed his capital letters, the slight leftward lean of his cursive, the habit he had of underlining the key point of any written argument, the way a carpenter marks a measurement, twice to be sure. He had filed it 14 days before the incident. He had documented in specific technical detail a series of safety violations in the lower processing unit, pressure regulation failures, inadequate ventilation maintenance, hazardous buildup in the filtration system that the overnight crew had flagged verbally to supervisors on at least 4 separate occasions without receiving a written response. He named the violations. He cited the federal safety codes they breached. He requested in writing that the facility be inspected and the affected unit taken offline pending review. The complaint had been received. There was a date stamp on the upper right corner. There was no record of any response. No inspection had been ordered. The unit had remained operational. 14 days later, it failed. I held the pages with both hands. The paper was fragile at the edges, and I was careful without deciding to be careful, the instinct to preserve something irreplaceable operating below conscious thought. I read it through once. Then again, Robert's handwriting, Robert's words. Robert's careful, methodical mind working through a problem, the way he worked through every problem thoroughly, honestly, without dramatic flourish. Just a man trying to make sure that the people around him went home safely at the end of a shift. He had known something was wrong. He had done exactly what a person is supposed to do. He had put it in writing and handed it to the people whose job it was to act on it. And then 14 days later, the thing he warned them about had happened. Exactly as he described it, in the exact location he had identified. I set the pages down on the table. Outside, the August evening was cooling the first suggestion of the coming fall in the air, moving through the window Marlowe had left open. I was aware of my own breathing, of the fluorescent light above the desk, of Linda's photograph on the corkboard, that full-body laugh caught in a hospital corridor years ago. Robert had known. He had tried to warn them, and someone had made certain he would never warn anyone again. If you're still here, comment 6, so I know you're still with me. And tell me this, if you were standing in that room knowing what I knew, would you stay silent? Or would you say everything and face the consequences? And just a quick note, parts of what comes next are fictionalized for storytelling purposes. If this isn't for you, now is the time to step away. The drive home took 40 minutes. I know that road. The way you know any road you have traveled so many times, it no longer requires your full attention. Every turn, every long straightaway, every place where the pavement dipped slightly at the edge of an old bridge repair. My hands were on the wheel at the positions my driving instructor had taught me 4 decades ago, and they stayed there tight and deliberate, because holding on to something solid was the only thing I trusted myself to do. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because composure is something I value for its own sake, but because the truth is simpler, there was nothing left. 30 years of slow, steady grief had used up whatever reservoir a person is given for that kind of release. What I felt instead, driving west through the August dark with the window cracked and the warm air moving across my face, was something harder and quieter. The particular weight of a thing that has been uncertain for a very long time finally becoming certain. I had spent 30 years believing my husband died in an accident. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment because I have been sitting with it my entire adult life. Every decision I made, staying in Huntington, going back to school, taking the job at the hospital, building the record year by year in the spiral notebooks that now filled an entire cabinet drawer, all of it had been constructed on the foundation of a word. Accident. a thing that happened. A convergence of mechanical failure and human error and bad timing that produced an outcome no one intended. That word was gone now, and everything built on top of it was shifting. I thought about Beckett. Not the Beckett who was 30 years old and living in Charleston and calling me on Thursday evenings with a voice full of something I had not heard before. I thought about the earlier versions, the ones I had carried alone through years that were harder than I generally let myself remember. He was 8 the summer he asked me about his father. We were in the backyard, the two of us, on a Saturday afternoon. He had been quiet all morning in the way children are quiet when something is working itself toward the surface. He was sitting on the back steps, pulling at a loose thread on his shoelace, when he looked up and asked, with the directness that had always been one of his defining qualities, "Was Dad brave, Mom?" I sat down beside him on the steps. I thought about Robert, the half-grin, the corny sincerity, the man who put things in writing because he believed that the people in charge of a situation were obligated to respond to what was in writing. The man who had looked at something dangerous and wrong and had not looked away from it. The bravest person I ever knew, I told him. And I meant it completely even then before I understood the full measure of what bravery had cost him. Beckett nodded, pulled the thread loose, moved on to something else the way children do when they have received the answer they were actually looking for. He was 16 the first time I let him drive on a real road. We had done the parking lot practice, the slow neighborhood loops, the careful right-angle turns into empty spaces. But the first time we merged onto Route 60 with actual traffic moving around us, I felt him tense from the passenger seat, the particular rigidity of someone concentrating so hard that their body forgets to breathe normally. He managed it fine. He always managed things fine. But at a red light 2 miles from home, he glanced over at me with that jaw-set expression I knew as well as my own reflection and said, "What if I make a mistake?" I had answered that question on instinct the way the truest parenting often happens, not from preparation, but from whatever rises up when the moment actually arrives. "Then you fix it and keep going," I said. He thought about that. The light changed. He drove us home without incident and pulled into the driveway more precisely than I would have managed at 16. He turned off the engine, sat for a moment, and then allowed himself a small private smile that he didn't quite manage to hide. I had tucked that smile away and kept it. He was 22 when he graduated. I was in the second row of a proper auditorium this time, not a folding chair, and I had Harriet on one side of me and an empty seat on the other that I had not planned and did not explain to anyone. When Beckett crossed the stage and found my face in the crowd, he always found my face even in large rooms, the way children are calibrated from birth to locate their mother. He gave me a small nod that contained more than a nod usually holds. Afterward, in the crowd outside, he hugged me for a long time, longer than 22-year-old men typically allow themselves in public. Then he pulled back and said with a seriousness that was entirely his father's, "I'm going to make you proud, Mom." I told him he already had, past tense, completely done. I pulled over somewhere on Route 60, the same road where he'd had his first real drive, and put the car in park. The darkness outside was the particular darkness of rural West Virginia at midnight total, in a way that city darkness never quite manages, the kind where the only light is what you brought with you. I sat with the engine idling and looked at nothing and thought about my son having dinner with a woman whose father had ensured that his own father never came home. Beckett didn't know. He was out there somewhere in Charleston, living his life forward in the way you live a life when you don't know what's underneath the ground you're walking on. He had built something real. He had found someone who made him sound the way he sounded on that Thursday phone call, lit up slightly off balance, moving toward something. He had done everything I raised him to do. And the question that sat with me in that parked car on that dark road was not whether I would finish what I had started with Marlowe. That answer had been settled in a records room in August. The question was what finishing it would cost, not me. I had made my accounting with the cost to myself years ago, somewhere between a closed FDA file and Linda's graveside in the April rain. What it would cost Beckett. Whether a man who had built his life on honest foundations could absorb the truth about the ground beneath them. Whether the version of his father I had given him, brave, careful, deliberate, would survive contact with what I now knew that bravery had actually meant. Whether knowing would change what he felt about the woman he was falling for, or whether it would simply change him in ways I couldn't predict and couldn't take back. I didn't have those answers. I sat with the questions instead, the engine running, the dark pressing gently against every window. Eventually, I put the car back in gear and drove the rest of the way home. The answer came the following morning at 7 o'clock. I hadn't seen it coming. The answer that arrived at 7 the next morning came in the form of a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, professional, pleasant, the kind of pleasant that is practiced rather than felt. She identified herself as Harlan Voss's personal assistant and informed me that Mr. Voss would very much appreciate the opportunity to have dinner with me at my earliest convenience. He understood I was a busy woman. He hoped I might find time in the coming weeks. The Greenbrier, she suggested, had a private dining room that offered a quieter setting for family conversations. I stood in my kitchen at 7 in the morning with yesterday still sitting somewhere behind my eyes, and I thought, so he knows. I said yes. I said it immediately before she finished the sentence because hesitation would have told him something I wasn't willing to give away for free. I wrote down the date she offered, a Thursday evening in July, and I hung up and stood very still for a moment in the kitchen light. Then I went to work. I had prescriptions to fill. I wore my oldest jacket. Not torn, not unpresentable, just old. The navy wool blazer I had bought the year Beckett started middle school. Slightly faded at the cuffs, the lining replaced once by a dry cleaner on 4th Avenue, who had done good work. I did not want to dress for this evening. I did not want Harlan Voss to see me in anything that suggested I had prepared, primped, or in any way treated this dinner as an occasion worth dressing for. I wanted to look like what I was, a woman from Huntington who'd been working all day and had stopped by on her way home. The private dining room at the Greenbrier was off the main corridor past the formal reception area through a door that required a staff escort, sound-dampening panels in the walls, a single table set for 2. The kind of room that exists for conversations that require privacy negotiations, confrontations, the specific category of discussion that benefits from the absence of witnesses. Harlan was already seated when I arrived. Navy suit, the good kind. That smile, the one I had watched operate in public for months through photographs and video clips, and the carefully managed media presence of a man who understood exactly how he appeared to people. Up close, it was the same smile, maybe slightly more direct. The smile of a man in a room where performance wasn't required. He stood when I entered, gestured to the chair across from him, thanked me for coming. I sat down. I did not thank him for the invitation. We went through the formalities the way 2 people do when both of them know why they are really there, but have agreed tacitly to approach the thing obliquely. He asked about my work. He said generous things about Beckett, genuinely generous, I noted, in the way that complicated men are sometimes genuinely fond of people, even while doing harm to everything around them. He talked about the wedding, about the plans Sabrina had been putting together, about how much he was looking forward to the families becoming properly acquainted. Then he set down his fork and his voice shifted. Not dramatically. The volume didn't change and the expression didn't change. But something in the register dropped the way a room temperature drops slightly when a window opens in winter, perceptible without being visible. He said he had become aware that I had been asking questions, reviewing certain records, that I had been in contact with a journalist at a regional publication who had a long-standing interest in pharmaceutical distribution practices. He said he understood that a woman in my position, given my history with the industry, might have concerns. He respected that. He wanted me to know that there were appropriate channels for those concerns, and that he would be personally happy to facilitate any formal inquiry I felt was warranted. I asked him how he had found out. He said only that Huntington General was a community institution, and that communities by their nature talked. Someone in that building had been watching. Someone had noticed the questions I had been asking about distribution records in the spring, and had carried that information somewhere it didn't belong. I filed that away. I would deal with it later. He continued. He said that a pharmacist's professional standing was one of the most valuable things a person in my field could possess, that it took decades to build and could be complicated very quickly by the appearance of, he chose his words carefully, irregularities in documentation practices, or questions about the integrity of personally maintained records. He let that sentence breathe. I looked at him across the table, this man in his good suit in his soundproofed room, and I stood up before he had finished his next thought. I picked up my bag. I told him I appreciated the meal. I walked out through the door and down the corridor and out through the main entrance into the July evening without looking back once. 1 month later, I sat at his dining table in Charleston. The house was what you would expect from a man of Harlan's particular relationship, with appearances large without being ostentatious, furnished with the restraint of old money that has learned not to shout. Beckett was across from me, relaxed in the way he was relaxed around Sabrina, the specific ease of a man in a place he has started to think of as familiar. He laughed at something her brother said. He refilled my water glass without being asked. He looked happy in the uncomplicated, forward-facing way of someone who believes the ground beneath him is solid. Sabrina was a careful host, warm with Beckett, gracious with me, and I watched her the way I had spent 30 years watching things that required watching. There was intelligence behind her composure, and something else, a calibrated awareness of what was being said and what wasn't. She knew something about her father's business that she had chosen or been guided to hold at a certain distance. Not ignorance. Something more deliberate than ignorance. The moment came during the second course. Harlan made a remark, angled, indirect, the kind of comment that has a surface meaning and an underneath one, and Sabrina glanced at him. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, a quick, assessing look that carried an entire conversation in it. I heard that. I understand what you mean. We will not discuss it here. Harlan's expression didn't change. Beckett was reaching for the bread basket. I watched it happen the way you watch something you've been trained by 30 years of careful attention to see completely quietly without letting anything show on my face. This was not a family dinner, it was a performance. And I had just realized I was the only one at the table who knew it. I heard the knock at 7:03, not because I was watching the clock, but because I had been at my desk since 6:15. And the morning had been quiet enough that the sound cut through cleanly 3 measured raps on the office door. Spaced with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided to do something difficult and is committed to seeing it through, I said, "Come in." The man who opened the door was younger than I expected, though I'm not sure what exactly I had expected. 38 tall, with the kind of posture that comes from years of boardrooms rather than anything athletic. He had Harlan's jaw and something in the eyes that Harlan didn't have, a tiredness that went deeper than sleep deprivation. The kind that comes from living alongside something you haven't been able to make yourself confront. He said his name was Whitmore Voss. He said he was sorry for showing up unannounced. He asked if he could sit down. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. The same chair where pharmaceutical representatives sat when they came with their samples and their talking points, where colleagues stopped by when they needed a second opinion, where I had spent 30 years receiving the ordinary traffic of a working life. Whitmore Voss sat in it carefully, the way a person sits when they are not sure they have the right to be comfortable. His eyes moved to the wall behind me, to Linda's photograph, the same one Marlowe kept on her corkboard, the hospital corridor, that full-body laugh. He looked at it for a moment longer than people usually look at photographs of strangers. "I read her interview," he said, "the one she gave in 2010, the one that never ran." I didn't respond. I waited. He looked back at me and said, "I've been a coward for 5 years. I need you to understand that before I say anything else, because what I'm about to ask you to consider requires a context that starts with me admitting that." He talked for 40 minutes. He had joined Crestline in 2018, brought in as COO by his father, with the understanding that he would modernize the operational infrastructure and eventually take over leadership of the company. For the first 2 years, he told himself what people in his position often tell themselves, that the irregularities he was seeing were historical, that the regulatory environment had changed, that his presence at the top was itself a corrective force. He used those words, corrective force, and then stopped and looked at his hands for a moment as though he didn't quite recognize them. By 2020, he knew better. By 2021, he had assembled enough of the internal picture to understand the full scope of what Kreslin had been doing and what his father had known, and for how long. And for 2 years after that, he had gone to work every morning and said nothing. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 4. I've been telling myself I was protecting the family, protecting her stability. That's what cowardice sounds like when you dress it up." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a small device on the desk between us. A USB drive. Matte black, no branding, smaller than my thumb. He told me what was on it. 5 years of internal documentation, distribution records, internal impact assessments, email chains between Harlan and the company's legal team dating back to 2004, and 4 separate internal reports commissioned between 2008 and 2016 that had quantified with clinical precision the projected human cost of each regional distribution push. His father had read every one of those reports. His father had signed off on the subsequent shipments anyway. The room was very quiet. Then Whitmore told me about Beckett. He said it carefully, which I appreciated, though it didn't soften what the words actually meant. In July of 2023, around the time Beckett and Sabrina had been together for nearly a year, Harlan had invited his future son-in-law to a private meeting. He had shown Beckett a portion of the Kreslin files, not the full record, a curated selection enough to raise questions, but framed entirely within Harlan's own interpretation. An object lesson in complexity, Whitmore said. His father's way of bringing someone inside the circle by making them feel they'd been trusted with difficult knowledge. Beckett had asked questions. Harlan had answered them in the way that Harlan answered everything thoroughly reasonably, with the calm authority of a man who has never once doubted his own version of events. 2 weeks later, Beckett had signed a consulting contract with a Kreslin-affiliated investment group, $850,000 annually renewable. He had not asked further questions after that. I sat with that information the way you sit with something that knocks the breath out of you carefully, waiting for the body to remember what it's supposed to do next. I was not angry at my son. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something more complicated than anger, the specific grief of watching someone you raised with everything you had encounter a moment that required more than everything you gave them, and choose the easier path. He was 30 years old. He was in love. He had been shown a door, and a man he trusted had stood beside it and said, "This is what's on the other side," and Beckett had believed him. I had spent 30 years learning not to believe that man. Beckett had not had 30 years. Whitmore had contacted the DEA 6 weeks earlier, quietly through a private attorney without his father's knowledge. He had provided preliminary documentation and had been in communication with 2 agents assigned to a regional distribution investigation that had been building, he said, for longer than most people realized. The federal case was structurally sound but strategically incomplete. They needed a moment of public documented, unambiguous action in a context that made evidence concealment effectively impossible. A large, formal, heavily attended event, one that Harlan Voss could not absent himself from without raising immediate questions. One at which his presence was not just expected, but required by every social and familial obligation a man in his position recognized as binding. Whitmore looked at me. I looked at the USB drive on the desk between us. The wedding had been scheduled for January. 450 guests. The Greenbrier Resort. White Sulphur Springs. The kind of event that gets photographed, documented, witnessed. The kind of event a father does not leave early. I picked up the drive. It weighed almost nothing in my hand, lighter than a key lighter than a pen. Smaller than the first spiral notebook I had filled in 2005. I turned it over once and set it back down. 32 years of questions. A closed FDA file. Linda's photograph on 2 different walls in 2 different offices. 47 names in the back of a notebook. A tattered internal complaint in Robert's handwriting, filed 14 days before the world changed. All of it had led to this desk this morning, this object the size of my thumb. There was one thing, though, that I had not accounted for, and it changed everything. He hung up before I finished the sentence. Not angrily, that almost would have been easier. It was the quiet kind of ending, the kind where the line simply goes dead and you're left holding a phone that has nothing more to offer you. I sat at the kitchen table with it in my hand for a long time afterward, listening to the particular silence of a house where a difficult thing has just happened and the walls haven't decided what to do with it yet. I had called Beckett on a Tuesday evening in early November. I had not planned a script I had learned over 30 years of raising him that scripts didn't work with my son. He heard the architecture underneath the words too clearly. So I had simply called, and when he answered, I had told him as directly and as carefully as I knew how that there were things about Crestline he needed to understand before January, that I had documentation, that I needed him to hear me. He said, "Mom, I know you have concerns. I've heard them." I said, "This is different." He said, "It's always different." And then the line went quiet. I set the phone on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the November sky had the flat gray quality of a month that has given up pretending it might still be fall. I looked at it for a while. Then I made myself a cup of tea. I didn't drink and sat with the understanding that had been assembling itself slowly over the past weeks. The one I had been resisting because it required accepting something painful about the limits of what a mother's voice can accomplish, when the person on the other end has already made choices that your words would threaten. You cannot talk someone into the truth. You can only build a situation in which the truth becomes impossible to look away from. I had known that for 30 years. I had just hoped in the particular irrational way that hope operates between parents and children that it wouldn't apply here. The message came 3 days later, an unfamiliar number West Virginia area code. The text was brief and careful in the way that messages are brief and careful when the person sending them has thought hard about what to say and how much Mrs. Carolyn. This is Darnell, Washington. I need to talk to you about the wedding. I think we can help each other. I read it twice. Then I typed back a single word, when. We met the following morning at a coffee shop on Fifth Avenue, a small place. The kind that has been in the same location for 20 years and smells permanently of dark roast, and the particular warmth of a room where the same people have been coming since before the neighborhood changed around it. I was there first. I took a corner table with my back to the wall the way I had learned to sit in rooms where I needed to see everything. He came through the door at 9:15. 20 years is a long time. The 18-year-old I had worked over in that emergency bay, thin, frightened, still wearing the expression of someone who had not yet understood what had almost happened to him, had become a man with width to his shoulders and a deliberateness to the way he moved through a space. He was 38 years old, and he carried it honestly the way people carry the years when the years have required something real from them. But his eyes were the same. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. There are people in your life who leave such a specific imprint on you that you recognize them in the people they loved, a particular quality of attention, the way of being present in a room that belongs to certain rare individuals and apparently can be passed on. Linda had looked at people the way she looked at them directly without armor, as though she had decided somewhere along the way that full attention was the least she owed anyone who came within her orbit. Darnell had her eyes. I had to take a moment before I said anything. He sat down across from me. He ordered coffee when the server came. He waited until she left before he spoke, and when he did, he started in the middle the way people start when they've been carrying something long enough that the preamble is worn away. He had been contacted in September by someone from the Crestline Foundation's Outreach Division. They were organizing the guest list for a January wedding, a celebration they called it, of the Voss family's commitment to community investment and recovery support. They wanted to include, alongside the business and civic guests, a small number of individuals whose lives had been positively impacted by the Foundation's recovery programs. Success stories, living evidence of the company's philanthropic commitment. They wanted Darnell to stand up in a room of 450 people and represent what Crestline had made possible. He said it without expression, the flat, precise delivery of a man describing something so cynical that emotional response feels inadequate to it. The company whose distribution practices had put him in that emergency room at 18 years old wanted to use his recovery as a backdrop for a celebration of the family that had run those practices. He had said yes. I looked at him. I said yes because I wanted to be in that room, he said, and because I knew what I was actually going to do when I got there. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at me. Before my mother passed, he said she talked about you. Not constantly, she wasn't that kind of person. But when things mattered, when she was saying the things she needed to say, while she still could, your name came up more than once. The coffee shop was doing its ordinary morning business around us. Someone's order was called at the counter. A chair scraped. The sounds of a regular day moving through a room where something irregular was happening in the corner. She said you'd been building something for a long time, Darnell continued. She said she'd been part of it for as long as she could and that she was sorry she couldn't finish it with you. And she said... He stopped, cleared his throat once quietly, started again. She said if there was ever a moment that needed someone to stand up in a room and tell the truth, I would know it when it came. And if I wasn't sure, I should find you. I did not trust myself to speak immediately. I looked at my hands on the table, the same hands that had filled those prescription logs, that had held Linda's at her kitchen table during the years when we were both still learning what we were up against, that had gripped a steering wheel on a dark road in August while the truth finished rearranging itself into its final shape. Linda had known. Even at the end, she had been thinking 3 moves ahead. She said you'd know what to do when the time came, Darnell said. I think the time's come, Mrs. Carolyn. The cemetery sits on a hill on the eastern edge of Huntington, and in January the wind comes off it without apology. I had driven there in the dark after midnight when the roads were empty enough that the headlights felt like the only light in the county. The January cold had been building for a week, the particular cold of the Appalachian winter that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply settles in and stays patient and indifferent until the world adjusts around it. Dry leaves skittered across the road as I turned through the gate, catching briefly in the headlights before disappearing back into the dark. I knew the path well enough to walk it without the flashlight I'd brought. 32 years of occasional visits will do that. Your feet memorize a route the way they memorize the layout of a house you've lived in long enough. Confident in the dark because the dark has become familiar. His name was cut into the stone in the plain block letters he would have chosen himself if anyone had thought to ask him. Robert James Mercer. The dates, nothing else. I had kept it simple on purpose back when simple was all I had the energy to manage. And over the years, I had come to understand that simplicity was exactly right for a man who had never required ornamentation to make himself understood. I stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. The wind moved through the bare trees at the edge of the cemetery, a low, steady sound, not mournful, exactly just present. The kind of sound that reminds you the world is indifferent to your particular moment, even while you are standing inside it. I put my hand in my coat pocket and found the folded paper I had carried there, a photocopy, the original safely stored of the internal complaint, filed in the second week of March 1993. His handwriting, his words. The careful, methodical documentation of a man who believed that putting something in writing meant someone was obligated to respond to it. I unfolded it. I couldn't read it in the dark, but I didn't need to. I knew every word by now. I found it, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, which surprised me. It took me 30 years, and I needed help I didn't have for most of it, but I found it. The wind moved through the trees. I told him about Harlan Voss, not the public version, not the award recipient and civic leader and father of the bride, but the man behind the investment records and the signed reports and the distribution decisions that had been made with full knowledge of what they would cost. I told him about the chemical plant, about the safety violations documented and ignored, about the chain of decisions that had led from a flagged pressure system to a Thursday night in March to a phone call at 11:17. I told him what I now knew about that night. I said it plainly without decoration because Robert had always responded better to plain speech than to anything constructed around it. Then I told him about Beckett. This part took longer. Not because I had more to say, but because some things require more space than others, and talking to Robert about the son he never saw grow up had always required space. I told him about the 8-year-old who had asked if his father was brave and had nodded at the answer with a seriousness too large for his face. About the 16-year-old learning to drive that jaw set against uncertainty, asking what if I make a mistake and accepting then you fix it and keep going as though it were a complete philosophy of living. About the graduation, the hug that lasted longer than 22-year-old men usually allowed themselves in public, the words, "I'm going to make you proud." I told him about the $850,000. I said it the way you say something that costs you something to say without flinching, because flinching doesn't change the fact of it. I told him that our son had been shown a door and had walked through it, and that I was still working out in the quieter parts of my thinking, how much of that was weakness, and how much was simply being 30 years old and in love, and presented with a version of the truth designed by a man who had been constructing versions of the truth for decades. He's still your son, I said. He's still everything you would have wanted him to be underneath this. I have to believe that. The stone was cold under my palm. When I pressed it, the specific cold of January granite, dense and real, and completely indifferent to the warmth of a human hand. I held it there anyway. Some gestures are not for the stone. Tomorrow, I said. It happens tomorrow. I stood there a few minutes longer, not speaking, just present the way you are present at the end of something that has required 32 years of your life. Then I folded the paper back into my pocket, turned up my collar against the wind, and walked back down the path to the car. The Greenbrier glowed against the January dark like something from another world. I had driven the 40 minutes from Huntington without music, without the radio, without anything except the sound of the road and my own breathing. When the resort came into view, lit from every window, the white columns catching the light. The long drive cleared of snow and lined with the discreet black vehicles of guests who had arrived from distances that required drivers, I pulled into the parking area and sat for a moment before getting out. Inside the ballroom was already filling. I checked the positions as I moved through the room the way you check the pieces of something you have been assembling for a long time before the moment it has to hold together on its own. Harriet was near the entrance to the east corridor in a deep green dress she had called me about twice in the preceding week, standing with a small group of guests with the particular ease of a woman who's been making strangers comfortable in social situations her entire adult life. She caught my eye across the room, gave me nothing that would have read as anything to anyone else, just the steadiness of a 30-year friendship compressed into a single look. Marlowe had taken a position at the press table along the north wall, her laptop open, her credentials displayed. She had submitted her press registration 6 weeks earlier, and it had been approved without question. A regional journalist covering a society wedding was unremarkable enough to pass through, without friction. She did not look at me when I passed. At the family tables near the front, Whitmore sat with his wife. His posture was controlled in the way that a person's posture is controlled when they are managing something internally and have decided not to let it reach the surface. He looked to anyone watching like a man attending his sister's wedding. He was, in fact, a man who had delivered 5 years of internal documentation to federal investigators and was now waiting to see if the structure he had helped build would hold. And at the VIP table. Harlan's table, the centerpiece of the arrangement closest to the head of the room, Darnell Washington sat in a dark jacket and a press shirt. A name card in front of him identifying him as a guest of the Crestline Foundation. A success story, a living testament to the company's commitment to community recovery. He sat straight-backed and still and looked out at the room with Linda's eyes. I found my table, the last one. Against the wall nearest the service corridor, the place card written in gold ink, with my name spelled correctly this time, because I had called ahead and made sure of it. I sat down. I smoothed the white linen in front of me. I placed both hands flat on the tablecloth and felt the solidity of the table beneath it, real, present, holding weight the way real things do. Above me, the chandeliers of the Greenbrier threw their light across 450 place settings. Across bone china and polished silver, and the assembled faces of people who had come to witness a beginning. The chandeliers overhead cast everything in gold. 450 people had no idea what was coming, and one woman had been waiting 32 years for this exact moment. Just a quick heads up before we continue, some details in this story are fictionalized for narrative and educational purposes, so they may not be entirely real. If you find this story meaningful, consider sharing it and subscribing for more. If not, you can step away here, no pressure at all. He rose the way men like him always rise unhurried, assured the movement of someone who has never once considered the possibility that a room might not be waiting for him. The conversation around me died in sections as he stood the way it always does for men who have cultivated that particular gravity over decades. By the time he reached his full height and lifted his glass, the room was his completely. 450 people turned toward the front with the collective instinct of an audience that has been cued, and Harlan Voss smiled the smile of a man who has never had to ask for silence in his life, because silence has always simply arranged itself around him. He began with Sabrina. The words were beautiful. I will not pretend otherwise, because accuracy matters more to me than the comfort of a simple story. He spoke about his daughter with a warmth that was entirely real. Real love operating inside a man capable of real harm is one of the more difficult things a person has to reckon with, and I had spent years reckoning with it. He described her the way a man describes something he is genuinely proud of, her intelligence, her steadiness, the way she had always known her own mind. The room leaned in, smiling, because what he was saying was true. And truth, even in the mouth of the wrong person, still sounds like truth. Then he spoke about the Voss family. 3 generations. Integrity and vision, the bedrock of everything they had built. He was masterful at it, the way he wove legacy into the air of the room, until it felt like something everyone present was breathing in together, until the name Voss carried the weight of an institution rather than a man. And then with a pivot so smooth it barely registered as a pivot at all, he turned to me. This time it was more precise than what he had tried before. He had calibrated it in the months since our dinner in the soundproofed room, had measured, I suspected, exactly how much pressure a woman from Huntington could absorb before a room full of his peers. He spoke about resilience, about the dignity of a modest life well lived, about how his son-in-law's journey was a testament to what determination could accomplish when a young man chose to reach beyond the circumstances of his upbringing. Every word landed where he intended it to land. I looked at Beckett. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the tablecloth. I looked at Darnell sitting straight-backed at the VIP table, his hands folded in front of him, his face completely still. I looked at Harriet, who was already watching me. Harlan raised his glass. I pushed back my chair. The sound it made was small, but in the half-breath of quiet that follows applause not yet begun, it carried. I stood up. 4 words. Flat. Even. The temperature of a clinical observation delivered to a room that had not asked for one. Let me answer that. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that because the story of what happened next has been described in ways that make it sound like an outburst, an eruption, a woman finally breaking after decades of pressure. It was not that. I had spent 32 years learning the difference between emotion and precision, and I understood standing at that table in my black dress with 450 faces turning toward me. That precision was the only thing that would hold. I spoke the way I had once filled out a formal complaint, completely methodically without leaving gaps that could be argued into. I told them who Robert was, not who Harlan had implied he was, the background, the context, the circumstance that a better man had escaped, but who Robert James Mercer actually was. A man who had filed a formal safety complaint 14 days before he did not come home. A man who had documented in specific technical detail the exact failure that would later be classified as an unavoidable accident. A man who had done precisely what a person is supposed to do and had received no response and had gone to work anyway because that was what the job required. I told them about Crestline Pharma Group. Behind Harlan, the presentation screen that the wedding coordinator had set up for the evening's photo tribute flickered once and changed. Marlowe had been waiting for her moment since 6:15. The first document filled the screen a distribution contract dated 2005, bearing Crestline Pharma Group's letterhead and a signature in the lower right corner that everyone in the room with any familiarity with the company's public filings would have recognized. Immediately, quantities, dates, regional distribution targets that bore no relationship to any legitimate therapeutic need in the counties listed. Hard numbers on a white background, clean and undeniable. The room made a sound I had never heard a room make before. Not quite a gasp. Something more like the sound of collective understanding arriving faster than people know how to process it. I kept speaking. The second document, the third. Each one a layer of the structure that Marlo and I had spent 2 years building internal impact assessments, email chains, the signed reports that quantified what each distribution push would cost in human terms, cost calculated and acknowledged, and signed off on and set aside. 32 years of a city quietly absorbing what this man's decisions had put into it, laid out on a screen behind him in the clean, irrefutable language of his own company's records. Harlan had not moved. He was still standing still, holding his glass, still wearing the expression of a man deciding in real time which version of this situation he could still control. Then Marlo stood up. "My name is Marlo Cooper. I'm an investigative journalist with the Huntington Herald. Every document on that screen has been independently verified. Copies have been submitted to federal investigators and will be published in full tomorrow morning." She sat back down with the calm of someone who has been waiting a long time to say a true thing in a room full of people who needed to hear it. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before. The silence before had been comfortable, the silence of an audience at ease. This silence had weight. Then Whitmore stood. He stood at the family table in the clear sight line of every person in the room, and he straightened his jacket once before he spoke. "My name is Whitmore Voss. I have served as Chief Operating Officer of Crestline Pharma Group for the past 5 years. What you are looking at is accurate. I have provided 5 years of internal documentation to the DEA. I am prepared to testify to everything on that screen and to considerably more." He did not look at his father. He sat down. The room had gone so still that I could hear the January wind pressing against the tall windows, the same wind that had moved through the cemetery 12 hours earlier, indifferent and patient. While I stood with my hand against cold stone and told Robert that tomorrow was the day. And then, from the VIP table, a man in a dark jacket and a pressed shirt stood up slowly. He did not move to the front of the room. He did not need to. He simply stood where he was at the table that had been assigned to him as a prop in someone else's story. And when he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who has decided that being heard is worth whatever it costs. "My name is Darnell Washington." He paused, just long enough for the name to reach every corner of the room. "I am one of the people that Crestline Pharma Group's practices almost took everything from. I was invited here tonight to be a symbol of this company's compassion." Another pause. "I am here instead as a witness." The room held its breath, and then the doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. They didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. The 3 men who came through the doors moved with the particular, unhurried authority of people who have already done every necessary thing before entering a room. Dark suits' credentials displayed without theater. They knew exactly where Harlan Voss was standing. They had known before they walked in. The room understood what it was looking at before anyone said a word. The lead agent stopped at a point equidistant from the head table and the center of the room. His voice when he spoke was neither loud nor soft. Simply clear the way a voice is clear when it has been trained to carry in large spaces without effort. He identified himself. He identified his agency. He stated that he was there to execute a federal arrest warrant for Harlan Voss. Then he read the charges. 47 counts. Unlawful distribution of controlled substances across 6 West Virginia counties. Wire fraud. Obstruction of a federal investigation on 3 separate occasions between 2006 and 2019. Conspiracy to falsify regulatory documentation. The list moved through the room like something physical, each count landing in the silence that had replaced the noise of 20 minutes ago, settling into the understanding of 450 people who had come for a wedding and were now witnesses to something they would spend years describing. 47 counts. I had 47 names in a notebook at home. I had carried them for 19 years. I don't believe in coincidence the way some people do, but I believe in the weight of a number that means something twice. Harlan had not moved from where he stood. The glass was still in his hand. He had never set it down after raising it for the toast that never completed itself. He listened to the charges the way a man listens to something he has anticipated long enough that its arrival produces recognition rather than surprise. There were no options left. Whitmore had made sure of it. The DEA had made sure of it. Marlowe had made sure of it. And I had spent 32 years making sure of it. When they placed Harlan in custody, quietly, efficiently, with the practiced minimum of physical engagement that federal protocol requires the sound that accompanied, it was very small, brief and mechanical. Someone near the windows made a soft, involuntary sound. Otherwise, the room held. I was watching Sabrina. She had been standing at the head table since the doors opened, and I watched something happen to her face that I had not fully anticipated. It was not the expression of someone whose plans had been disrupted. It was not controlled composure failing under pressure. It was the expression of a person understanding two things simultaneously, each one made worse by the other. Her father being taken into federal custody, and the realization I could see the exact second it completed itself behind her eyes that the version of him she had been given across a lifetime of careful framing was not the whole of who he was. The composure she had maintained all evening came apart quietly, without drama. Her eyes filled. Her hands found the back of her chair. Beckett moved to her immediately, the instinct of a man who loves someone operating below the threshold of everything else, and put his hand on her back. She was not a villain in this. She was a daughter who had been handed an inheritance she didn't fully understand until it was too late to refuse it cleanly. The grief on her face was real and layered in the way only betrayal by someone you love can be layered. They walked Harlan toward the main entrance. The room parted around them, instinctively, 450 people making space for something they didn't know how to stand near. He walked without resistance posture, still intact, the last form of control available to a man who has run out of everything else. Halfway through the room, he found me. I had not moved from where I was standing. He looked at me with the attention of a man who needs to understand what defeated him, and I looked back with the steadiness of a woman who had 32 years to prepare for this moment. I wanted him to see me completely, the pharmacist from Huntington, the widow, the mother who had kept every record and been told more than once that what she had was not enough. I did not look away. He looked away first. The doors settled behind him and he was gone. The room exhaled. Not celebration, not yet. The sound of a large group of people absorbing something that had no precedent in their experience of January wedding receptions. I turned and looked at Beckett. He was still beside Sabrina, his hand on her back, his face drained of color. 31 years old, and he had just watched his future father-in-law walked out in federal custody. Somewhere in the preceding 40 minutes, he had also absorbed the full weight of what I had said, what it meant, what it connected to, what it required him to reckon with about the past 2 years of his own choices. He looked at me, his mouth opened. Mom, The jaw set the way it had been setting since he was 9 years old when something was too large for the available words. I looked at my son for a long moment. Then I picked up my bag and walked toward the east corridor. Harriet was behind me before I reached the door. I didn't hear her move, but I felt her presence the way you feel someone who's been beside you long enough that their proximity registers before thought. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Through the noise of a room beginning to find its voice again, I heard Beckett say my name once more. I kept walking. Some truths need space before they can become conversations. The parking lot of the Greenbrier was still half full when I pulled out. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because I had already seen everything that needed seeing in that room, and what came next required looking forward rather than back. The January night pressed against the windshield as I turned onto the main road and pointed the car west toward the mountains toward home. 2 hours. That was the drive. I had made it hundreds of times in both directions for work for Beckett's school events, in the years when he'd lived closer. For the accumulated ordinary reasons a person travels a road until it becomes as familiar as the hallway of their own house. Tonight, it felt like a different road, not unfamiliar. Just altered the way everything is altered after a thing you've been moving toward for a very long time finally arrives and becomes the past. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. I did not cry, which surprised me a little. I had expected something to release on the drive home, some pressure that had been building since I walked through those ballroom doors. But what I felt instead was a particular kind of quiet that I had not experienced before. Not the quiet of waiting. Not the quiet of grief or suppression or a person holding themselves carefully together, just quiet, the specific silence of a thing that has been said completely and without reservation and cannot be unsaid. I let it fill the car and I drove through it. Somewhere past Lewisburg, the road climbs. There's a point on the westbound drive where the highway crests and the valley opens below you, and on a clear winter night, if the clouds have pulled back enough, you can see the lights of the towns spread across the dark like something scattered and held. I had passed this point 100 times without stopping. Tonight, I pulled onto the shoulder and cut the engine. Huntington was 2 hours ahead invisible from here. But the lights below me belonged to the same stretch of West Virginia that had been home my entire adult life. The same geography that had given me Robert and taken him and given me Beckett and given me Linda. And given me 32 years of a question that had finally found its answer in a ballroom full of people in formal wear who had not expected their evening to go the way it went. The city below was still lit, still breathing, still in its particular and stubborn way alive. Huntington had been absorbing damage for decades, economic, industrial, pharmaceutical, the slow accumulated weight of a region that the larger world had found convenient to overlook. It was still there. The people I had spent my career dispensing medication to filling forms for keeping records on behalf of, they were still there. Some of them had not survived what had been done to their city. Many had. Many were still fighting in the specific daily way that survival requires, when the crisis is long and the resources are short, and nobody with real power has yet decided that your zip code is worth their full attention. I sat on that overlook for 20 minutes. Then I started the car and drove the rest of the way home. The months that followed moved the way months move after something large faster than you expect and slower than you need. In February of 2025, a federal grand jury formally indicted Harlan Voss on 47 counts. The proceedings were covered by 3 national outlets and every regional paper within 200 miles. Marlowe's full investigation ran the morning after the arrest, as she had promised the documents, the timeline, the internal communications, all of it in print and online simultaneously. Her editor, she told me afterward, had not hesitated for a single second. Times had changed, or perhaps certain stories had simply become impossible to kill. In March, Crestline Pharma Group ceased operations. The announcement came through a legal filing, 3 paragraphs, no statement from leadership. The building in Charleston was locked within a week. Sabrina left West Virginia sometime in late February. I learned this not from Beckett, but from Whitmore, who sent me a brief message saying only that his sister had relocated and that he hoped I was well. I sent back 3 words, I hope so too. I meant it for both of them. Beckett did not call. I did not call him. This is not a thing I am proud of or ashamed of. It is simply what happened. And it happened because I had meant what I said. Walking out of that ballroom, some truths require room before they can be approached directly. And I had learned over 32 years that forcing a conversation before its time produces noise rather than understanding. He needed to find his way to me. I needed to let him. In March of 2025, I signed the incorporation papers for the Huntington Hope Foundation. The name had been Harriet's suggestion offered over coffee one Saturday morning, in the way Harriet offered most important things casually, almost as an aside, as though the idea had simply occurred to her, and she was sharing it before it slipped away. I had sat with it for a week before agreeing that it was right. The foundation had 3 functions: legal support for families pursuing accountability in cases connected to the opioid distribution crisis, scholarships for children in West Virginia who had lost a parent to the crisis because the children were always the part the news coverage forgot to follow past the initial story, an ongoing advocacy for federal reform of pharmaceutical distribution oversight because the system that had allowed Crestline to operate for 2 decades was not a Crestline problem, it was a structural problem, and structural problems require structural solutions. Darnell joined the board of directors in April. He brought 3 other people with him, men and women from Huntington and Mingo County, and Logan, who had their own versions of the story, and had been waiting in their own ways for somewhere to put it that might do some good. Harriet asked me about Beckett once. We were in her kitchen a Sunday in April, the kind of afternoon that arrives in Appalachia after a long winter, with the particular relief of something that had seemed theoretical finally becoming real. She asked the way Harriet asks things. She already half knows the answer to, directly without preamble, giving me the option to answer without requiring me to. Do you miss him? I thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. I thought about the 8-year-old and the 16-year-old and the 22-year-old and the 31-year-old standing in a hotel ballroom with his hand on a woman's back while the world rearranged itself around him. I miss who he was, I said. The rest is still being decided. Harriet nodded. She poured more coffee. We sat with the April light coming through the window and didn't need to say anything else. What I didn't know was that he was already trying to find his way back, quietly without asking anyone's permission. October in Huntington arrives without announcement. One morning, the light is different. Lower amber, coming through the office windows at an angle that wasn't there the week before, and you understand that the season has changed while you were busy with other things. I had been busy with other things for most of the year. The foundation had consumed the kind of time that useful work consumes when it is new and underfunded and run by people who care more than they sleep. Maria coordinated our volunteers with the organized energy of someone who treats every name on a sign-up sheet as a personal commitment. She had joined us in May, a former social worker from Logan County who had spent 15 years navigating the same systems our clients were now trying to access. She knew every shortcut and every dead end before her first week was finished, and she had the specific gift of making overwhelmed people feel temporarily less overwhelmed, which in our line of work was not a small thing. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, she set a folder on my desk. I wanted you to see this before the weekly review. Her tone carried the careful neutrality she deployed when delivering information she wasn't sure how I would receive. Volunteer profile. One of our regulars. He's been with us since April. I thought you should see it first. I opened the folder. The intake form was standard name, contact information, availability, skills. He had listed his background in corporate risk consulting and noted in the comments that he had personal reasons for wanting to support the foundation's work and would prefer direct family services over administrative tasks if possible. He had been coming in since the first week of April, 3 days a week, sometimes 4. He worked specifically with families navigating the compensation claim process, the documentation requirements, the legal language, the procedural steps that become genuinely impossible for people who are grieving and exhausted and managing the ordinary demands of survival at the same time. Maria told me he stayed late regularly, that he had driven 2 families to appointments when transportation was the barrier between them and a deadline, that he brought his own lunch and never mentioned it, that he had quietly covered the filing fee for 1 family out of his own pocket when our current funding didn't reach a gap in the paperwork and had asked her not to make it a thing. 6 months, starting 1 week after the foundation opened its doors. I looked at the photograph clipped to the upper right corner, a candid taken during a session. A man in a plain gray shirt sitting beside an older woman leaning slightly forward, his finger tracing a line on a form he was walking her through. His face was turned toward her, not toward the camera. His expression was the expression of someone paying complete attention to another person's problem. I recognized the jaw, the posture, the particular quality of focus that had been there since he was 8 years old, asking careful questions about his father. I drove to the volunteer center that afternoon. Through the glass panel in the door of the main working room, I could see him before he saw me. He was seated at a table near the window with a family, a man and a woman in their 40s, the exhaustion of people who have been managing something hard for longer than they had prepared for. Between them, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 sat with a coloring book open on the table, working with the focused industry of a child who has learned to make herself small in adult spaces. Beckett was explaining something, his voice inaudible through the glass, his hands moving over the form with the patience of someone who has walked this path enough times that the steps have become familiar, but understands they are not familiar to the person across the table. I pushed the door open. He looked up. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room had other people in it, and then in the way rooms sometimes do, when something shifts, it had effectively only 2. The family across from Beckett exchanged a quiet look. The father said something low. Beckett nodded. They gathered the girl and her coloring book and found a reason to be elsewhere with the graceful discretion of people doing someone a kindness. We were alone. Beckett stood slowly the way he stands when he's not sure what the next moment requires. He looked older than January, not worse older, in the way that certain reckonings age a person, honestly adding something real rather than taking something away. He was wearing the same gray shirt from the photograph. His expression was something I had not seen on my son's face before, open, uncertain, completely without performance. He said, "Hi, Mom." 2 words, simple as a door left ajar. I sat down in the chair across from where he had been sitting. He sat back down after a moment, carefully, as though sudden movements might disturb something fragile between us. The compensation form the family had left was still spread across the table. Section C, documentation requirements, 3 items highlighted in yellow. We sat in the silence that had been building between us since January. Not hostile. The silence of 2 people who have said everything wrong and done everything imperfect and are now in the same room without either of them having planned it, waiting to find out if something underneath all of that is still intact. I looked at my son. I looked at the highlighted form on the table. I looked at the window where the October light was doing what October light does in Appalachia, making everything look briefly more beautiful and more fragile than it actually is. He had been here for 6 months, working without asking for forgiveness, just working. And somehow that said more than any apology could have. He waited until the room had settled completely around us. Then he folded his hands on the table. The compensation form still spread between us 3 items, highlighted in yellow. Someone else's paperwork bearing witness to this moment, and he looked at me with the directness that had always been one of his truest qualities. Even when he was using it to say something that cost him, I knew Mom. His voice was steady in the way a voice is steady when a person has rehearsed not what to say, but simply how to say it honestly. I knew enough. Harlan showed me what he wanted me to see, and I understood it wasn't the whole picture, and I signed the contract anyway. I chose the money. No qualification, no architecture of excuse built carefully around the admission to soften its edges. Just the fact of it placed on the table between us like the paperwork present, readable, impossible to misinterpret. I looked at my son, 32 years old. The tiredness on his face was the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something they should have set down months ago and have only recently found the ground level enough to do it. He was more recognizable to me in this moment sitting in a plain gray room in a volunteer center on Jefferson Avenue than he had been in any formal setting over the past 3 years. I said, "I know." He nodded once. He didn't ask how long I had known or what I had done with that knowledge. He simply received it the way a person receives confirmation of something they had already worked out and had been dreading. Then I told him 3 things I had never said out loud to him before. The first was Pittsburgh. I told him about the letter. January 2009, $195,000 a year. a research position that would have taken us 4 hours north and given me the infrastructure I had been building by hand for 15 years. I told him I had called and declined before he came home from school and then burned the letter over the kitchen stove that evening while he slept. I told him I stayed because of the work and because of Huntington and because leaving felt like abandoning something I had promised I would finish. I did not tell him I stayed because of him, because that would have been a weight I never intended for him to carry, and I wasn't going to place it there now. But I watched his face as I spoke, and I saw him understand it anyway the way children understand the things their parents choose not to say. The second was his father's complaint. I told him about the document, the handwriting, the 14 days, the flagged pressure system, and the unanswered report. I told him that Robert had known something was wrong and had done exactly what a person is supposed to do, and that it had not been enough, and that for 32 years I had not known why. I told him I knew now. I told him his father had been, in the most specific and documented sense of the word, the bravest person I had ever known. Beckett did not speak. His jaw was set, but differently than I had seen it set before. Not against pain, against something more complex than pain. The third thing was the 32 years themselves. I told him what it had been like to believe for the entire span of his life that his father had died in an accident. To build everything, the education, the work, the record, the foundation, on the foundation of a word that turned out to be a lie. I did not tell him this to produce guilt. I told him because he was 32 years old and he deserved to know the full shape of the thing his mother had been carrying while she was also carrying him. When I finished, the room was very quiet. Beckett looked at the table, then at me. Then he said, "He would have been a good father." Yes, I said, he would have been. We sat with that for a moment. Then I said the thing I had come somewhere during the drive across town to understand I needed to say. "I forgive you." I said it plainly, the way I had learned over 30 years to say difficult things without decoration, because decoration suggests uncertainty about whether you mean it. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as trust, and trust is going to take time. He looked at me steadily. No protest, no negotiation, no request that I qualify or soften or move the timeline. "I know," he said. "I'll be here." 4 words, the same weight as a promise. I chose to let them land that way. November arrived the way November does quietly, with the particular gray light of a month that has decided warmth is no longer its responsibility. Beckett became a consistent presence at the foundation without taking a title or asking for one. He showed up. He did the work. He stayed late on the days when the caseload required it and left without ceremony on the days when it didn't. The families who worked with him did not know who he was in relation to the organization or its founding. They only knew he was the man who explained the forms clearly and drove people to appointments when the bus route didn't cooperate. Darnell had taken on the role of community ambassador, visiting schools and community centers in Cabell and surrounding counties, telling his story in the direct and unadorned way he told everything, making himself available to young people who needed to see that the road through a difficult thing could lead somewhere real. He was good at it in the way people are good at something that costs them and matters to them equally. Marlowe received a state journalism award in November for the Crestline investigation. She called me the morning it was announced and said in the dry way she said things she felt deeply Linda should be getting this. I told her Linda would have said the same thing about her. We were both right. Harriet brought coffee to the office on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, as she had been doing since March, because Harriet expressed care through the repetition of small, reliable acts and had been doing so for 30 years and saw no reason to change her methodology now. The first morning Beckett and I had coffee together was a Thursday in late November. He arrived before I did. I found him already in the small kitchen at the back of the office, 2 cups poured, sitting at the table with his hands wrapped around one of them, the way his father used to hold a cup. He looked up when I came in, moved the second cup slightly toward my side of the table. We talked about the caseload, about a family from Lincoln County whose claim had hit a documentation problem we needed to work around, about whether the foundation should apply for a particular federal grant that Maria had flagged. Ordinary things. The machinery of a working day beginning. We did not talk about Harlan. We did not talk about the wedding or Charleston or $850,000 or the January night when everything that had been building for 32 years finally broke the surface. There was time for all of that. There would be more mornings. Everything was ordinary, and after everything we had been through, ordinary felt exactly like a miracle. The cemetery looks different in the morning. I had only ever come here in the evening, before after work, after difficult days, in the particular darkness of nights when I needed somewhere to put something too large for the house on Cyrus Creek Road. But on a Friday morning in November, with the sun still low and the light coming in sideways through the bare trees, the place had an entirely different quality. Not somber, almost gentle the way early light is gentle before the day has fully committed to itself. The leaves had come down since my last visit. A few of them had settled against the base of Robert Stone, the amber and rust colors of an Appalachian autumn that arrives late and leaves reluctantly. I didn't brush them away. They looked right there, as though the season had arranged them on purpose. I stood with my hands in my coat pockets this time. No paper, no rehearsed words. I had come without an agenda, which was new for me. Most of my visits here had carried the weight of something I needed to say, or decide, or report. This morning I had simply driven over because it felt like the right place to be on a Friday in November, when you have run out of things to prove. It worked, I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, the way voices do when the space around you is peaceful enough that speaking feels like a small interruption. I know I told you it would, but I wanted to come back and say it out loud when it was true, instead of just when I needed it to be. I told him about the trial. Harlan had entered a plea in September that had made a lengthy courtroom proceeding unnecessary, the weight of what Whitmore had provided. Combined with what Marlowe had published and what the DEA had assembled over the preceding year, had produced a legal situation with very few remaining exits. The sentencing was scheduled for January. 32 years after a Thursday night in March, the record would finally say the true thing. I told him about the foundation. 63 families in the first year, 4 scholarships awarded to children in Cabell and surrounding counties who were growing up without a parent because of a distribution system that had treated their communities as acceptable losses. Ongoing advocacy work that had produced in October a formal response from a federal legislative office that suggested the bill we had been supporting might actually move in the coming session. Real things. Slow things. The kind of progress that doesn't photograph well, but compounds over time. I told him about Beckett. I told him his son was sitting across from grieving families 3 days a week and explaining paperwork with the patience of someone who has decided that patience is the least he owes, that he had his father's quality of attention, the ability to make another person feel that their particular problem is the only thing in the room worth thinking about. That I believed not completely and not without reservation, but genuinely that he was finding his way back to himself. I think we're going to be all right, Robert. I said it the way you say something when you mean it without sentimentality, plainly as a report, not the way it should have been. But all right in a different way. The kind of all right you build instead of the kind you're given. The low sun moved a degree or two through the trees. A bird started somewhere above me and stopped. The morning continued its quiet business. I stood there a few minutes longer. Then I said goodbye the way I had been saying goodbye at this particular stone for 32 years, without ceremony, without drama. The way you say goodbye to someone who is part of your daily life, even in their absence. I walked back to the car. I drove home. I made coffee. I went to work. December arrives in Huntington with the particular commitment of a month that means it. I was at my desk on an evening in the second week late, the rest of the office dark, the small lamp making a circle of light that contained the desk and not much else. I had a grant report to finish and a board meeting to prepare for and a stack of case files that Maria had flagged for my review. The ordinary machinery of a working life generating its ordinary demands. At some point, I stopped writing and sat back in my chair and looked at the wall. 11 months ago, I had stood up in a room full of people who had not expected me to stand up, and I had asked a question. Do you want to know who I am? I had meant it as a challenge in that moment, as the opening of a record I had spent 32 years compiling. But sitting in the quiet of the December office, I found myself thinking about the question differently. Not as a challenge, as an honest inquiry. The kind worth answering properly for yourself when nobody is watching. So I answered it. My name is Carolyn Mercer. I am a clinical pharmacist, licensed in the state of West Virginia, employed for 26 years at Huntington General Hospital, and now serving as founding director of the Huntington Hope Foundation. I am 64 years old. I have been a widow since I was 32. I am the mother of a 32-year-old man who is currently figuring out who he wants to be, and I believe he is going to get there. I am the woman who kept a spiral notebook for 19 years because she understood before she could prove it that something was wrong. I am the woman who burned a job offer in her kitchen and stayed in a city that needed her more than she needed the money. I am the woman who stood up when 450 people were watching and said the true thing clearly without her voice shaking. That is who I am, all of it. The grief and the stubbornness and the years of work that nobody saw and the one moment that everyone saw. None of it more important than the rest. If you are listening to this and you are sitting on something you know is wrong, if you have the records, the dates, the pattern that no one else has taken the time to see, I want you to hear this from someone who waited longer than she should have. Silence protects the people who deserve it least. It has always worked that way. It will keep working that way until someone decides to stop being quiet. You don't have to wait 32 years. I did not know when I started that it would take that long. I don't think it has to take that long for you. The tools are better now. The channels exist. The people willing to listen are there if you find the right ones. But when you are ready to stand up, stand up. The room will be quieter than you expect. Your voice will be steadier than you think. And the truth, it turns out, does not require your permission to be true. It only requires someone willing to say it out loud. I turned back to the grant report. The lamp made its small circle. Outside, the December dark pressed gently against the window. I am 64 years old. I spent half my life waiting for justice and the other half building it. It turns out the building part mattered more. People have called this a family drama story. Others have called it one of the most powerful family revenge stories they've ever come across. I understand why. But sitting here, I want to be honest with you about what it actually was from the inside. It wasn't revenge. Revenge is about making someone feel what you felt. What I wanted was simpler and harder than that I wanted the record to say the true thing. I wanted Robert's name attached to the truth of what happened to him. That's not revenge. That's just refusing to let a lie be the last word. Here is what I wish someone had told me 30 years ago: don't do it the way I did. Don't carry it alone for 3 decades. Don't fold the evidence into a cabinet drawer and tell yourself you're waiting for the right moment. Because the right moment doesn't arrive on its own, you have to build it. I lost years I could have spent differently. I missed chances to act when the system might have been more responsive. I let the weight of it shape me in ways I'm still sorting through. Find your people earlier. Find your Harriet, your Linda, your Marlowe. Because every family drama story that ends with justice has one thing in common: nobody got there alone. The truth is heavy, but it was never meant to be carried by one person. Among all the family revenge stories I have heard over the years, the ones that haunt me most are the ones where people waited too long and I was almost one of them. Don't be. This is not a family drama story with a clean ending. Beckett and I are still rebuilding. Sabrina is somewhere I don't know. The foundation is real, but the work is long. Justice came, but justice doesn't give you back the years. I want you to know that because the stories we tell about standing up sometimes make it sound like winning fixes everything. It doesn't. It just means the right thing finally got said. What it gave me was this: I can sleep now. For the first time in 32 years, I am not carrying an unanswered question to bed every night. I believe, and I say this as someone who has spent a lifetime in science and evidence, that God does not ask us to wait for someone else to act. He gives us the information, the ability, and the people. What we do with those things is our part of the arrangement. Most family revenge stories end with fire. The ones that matter end with something being built, not just something being broken. This is mine, and I am still building. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Carolyn's shoes? Would you have waited? Or would you have acted sooner? Your perspective genuinely matters to me. This story was inspired by real social issues around pharmaceutical accountability and family loyalty. Some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't your thing, no hard feelings at all, feel free to explore other videos that speak to you more. And if it did resonate, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next.
That's the story. I hope it stayed with you. I will see you in the next one.